Some people celebrate the holidays, but you dominate the holidays. You deck the halls, the mantle, and anything else that will stand still. You deserve a bold cold brew that's as festive as you. Topped with creamy cookie butter cold foam, covered in cookie butter crumbles, and perfectly pairable with our new cookie butter donut, Dunkin's Cookie Butter Cold Brew is a delicious match for your decked out domination. America runs on Dunkin'. Price and participation may vary. Limited time offer. Terms apply.
Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And this week we're going to be talking about the South Carolina nullification crisis and John Calhoun. And Chris, you know, we're here in southeastern North Carolina, and I'm willing to bet a lot of people have never heard of the South Carolina nullification crisis and may not even know who John Calhoun was.
But one thing that they are familiar with is the Civil War and the devastating consequences that come as a result of that Civil War. And that does lead into the nullification crisis and John C. Calhoun, because in a very real way, his words, his works makes him pretty much the trigger point, the spark that helped start the Civil War.
Yeah, because he is a big champion of nullification, and it's going to cause a lot of problems between him and Andrew Jackson. And of course, it's going to cause a lot of controversy there between South Carolina and the federal government. So let's sort of dive into this. We'll talk about John Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, of course, was born in a little town in 1782 in South Carolina, known as Abbeville, South Carolina. And it is on the northwestern side of South Carolina. I guess that's where I would place it. And he's born there. He grows up there in South Carolina. And of course, he's going to go through a lot of different things growing up in South Carolina. Now, it's very interesting that, he's born in 1782. So by this point, the United States is already a free nation. The Constitution hasn't been written. That would happen in 1787. But he's coming in, he's pretty much, we could say, born an American citizen. He's not like, George Washington and some of these others who were before him, who were born as British citizens, but then, transitioned to American citizens. John Calhoun is born and raised in South Carolina. So he's an American citizen from his birth.
And also at the point that he is born, he's growing up in South Carolina, which is right there in the middle of this boom in cotton. Cotton is becoming a major staple. His dad is a successful farmer in cotton, and Calhoun's going to have a very interesting life because his upbringing, I think, does lend itself to his views politically as well as socially. But it's also interesting in that Calhoun is kind of on the pendulum. He swings in his different views of how he believes the government should be involved. And, at the beginning of his career, I think that he is a strong federalist, where he believes in the importance of the federal government, that they need to really be in control. And then, when we start getting into the nullification crisis, we're going to see that he becomes this champion of states' rights and succession. And I think that is just an interesting take on how people's views can not just change, but can change dramatically based on certain events in one's life.
Yeah, and he does have some very tragic events. He grows up, like I said, there in South Carolina. He's a little bit of a bookworm. He likes to read. He likes to go to school. He shows a good amount of skill in that particular area in his life. But things are going to get interrupted for him when he's 14 years old and his father passes away, which I think we've mentioned in other episodes throughout this podcast, Chris, that, back in these times, back in the, I think this occurred, if he's born in 1782, so this is occurring before 1800, it wasn't uncommon for people to die suddenly. and to die of things that we probably wouldn't. I don't know what his father died of, but to die to things that we probably wouldn't think anything about. Today you have a little stomach pain on your left or right side. You go to the doctor, it's appendicitis. They take it out, give you some antibiotics, and you go on with your life. But in the late 18th century, if you had appendicitis, most likely that was a death sentence. So people died a lot at very young ages, in their 20s, 30s, and 40s back at this particular time. But after the death of his father, he sort of has to take over the family farm, and he sort of has to grow up really fast and sort of, I guess, in a way, become the man of the house in a way. But despite all of that, he does keep studying, he keeps reading, and he ends up at Yale College there in Connecticut.
Well, and, as you say, he does become, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but he begins to study under these individuals. And, then I believe after Yale, doesn't he go to law school? And he comes across another kind of supporter of strong federal government. And so all of these people are kind of teaching him. So I think you can see, here's Calhoun that's kind of being pulled in two different directions. He's being pulled back, to his home roots in South Carolina, to a growing Southern economy of cotton, but also to a home, his father had slave holdings. And so you have that going on. And then you have, this education that he's receiving from up north that is kind of teaching him about the strong federal government. And they actually, those individuals from up north, kind of help him win election to Congress. He becomes a congressman. And when he gets there, he starts hanging around people that are like Henry Clay and James Madison and some of those other individuals. And, he will really strongly, I think, encourage the nation to spend money that would bring the republic together. He wanted to create roads and canals. And I think he even said, let us conquer space. Some of those things where he wanted to allow the federal government to make states better.
It is interesting, though, going sort of swinging back to his personal life here. I know you were talking a lot about his professional life and all of that. In his personal life, he gets married. And Chris, this is sort of one of those things that I find very interesting in history, is who he married. He marries his first cousin. She is the daughter of a senator and a lawyer, John E. Calhoun of Charleston, South Carolina. And of course, this is moving him up in the world. You talk about his education, going to law school, the people he was working around and living around at this particular point in time, but also the ability to marry someone who in some ways is marrying up. That's an important thing at this point. That's how you move forward. One way, anyway, you move forward in society was to marry someone of means, marry someone who was sort of connected in. And he certainly did that with this cousin he marries.
But once again, you have this, I'll continue to go back to it, this struggle that he's facing, because as you mentioned, he's married this girl from the South. He's got influential people in the North. And during this particular time, what you're starting to see is a division in the North and in the South. In the North, you have industry, you have economy, and that is allowing the North to grow in power and influence each and every day. And yet down in the South, you have the cultivation of cotton and tobacco and other cash crops, if you will. And so the South is becoming more of an agrarian society. And there is a huge dividing line. And in the South, the reliance on slavery to help the industry of cotton and all of those other cash crops is being looked at unfavorably in the North. And here's Calhoun, has friends in the North. He's got family in the South. His own family's from the South. His property's in the South. He comes in as a federal supporter of a strong federal government, but then people in South Carolina, people in the South, they begin to find themselves on the defensive because they feel that when the North starts attacking them, whether it's on slavery or anything else, that they see that it's an attack on the Southern economy. And if it's an attack on the Southern economy, then it's an attack on the Southern home. It's an attack on John E. Calhoun's family. It's an attack on John Calhoun's family. And so now the people in South Carolina are looking at John Calhoun and say, hey, who do you support? Are you going to support your family? Are you going to support the people that have put you in power up there in the North and who are telling you what to do? You know, what are you going to do? And I think that's when the moment kind of comes to a head for John Calhoun. That's at the same moment that history is really starting to see this monumental divide in the North and South, you know, with events such as the Missouri Compromise and other things of that nature, to where Calhoun is going to have to reevaluate, is he a strong state supporter or is he going to be a strong federal government supporter?
Yeah, and he's ultimately, like I think you've already said, he's going to go in the state direction ultimately. You know, he serves there in the U.S. House of Representatives representing South Carolina. He does that actually throughout. And, you know, you think about someone like Calhoun, he's living in a monumental time. There's so much going on. You just mentioned some of that, but also think about the War of 1812. You know, he's been a member of the House for about a year when all of that breaks out. And he's in the House until 1817 when he becomes Secretary of War. He was the 10th Secretary of War. And I think, what was that, James Monroe maybe, that he was, I don't think it was Madison, I think it was Monroe, that he's Secretary of War for. And he does that for a number of years. And that sort of brings us to this idea of the nullification crisis, because in 1825, he is picked up as vice president for none other than Andrew Jackson. That's not correct.
No, wasn't that 1828? Yeah.
I said that and I thought that doesn't sound right. 3, 2, 1, start over again. So in 1828, he's going to be picked up to be vice president for Democrat President Andrew Jackson. And he's going to serve in this role for a number of years. And this, Chris, brings us to the nullification issue. And again, nullification means something he had sort of supported, and he's going to be down there in South Carolina, I guess, in a way, stirring the pot a little bit to sort of get this going. But Chris, do you want to talk about some of the issues that brought about nullification there in South Carolina?
Well, I think it's important to kind of go back, and I mean, we got to look at Calhoun as the person, because he's not necessarily just in it for the sake of the United States. He's not in it just for the South. He's in it for himself. And he realizes very quickly on that if he stays associated with Adams, that his popularity is going to suffer, his wealth is going to suffer, his family's going to suffer, because what John Q. Adams is wanting to do is he's wanting to promote national economic development, national social development, national cultural development. And if Calhoun aligns himself in that, continues to align himself with that, he's going to be disowned in the South. So what he does is he switches sides. And I think that it's important, you know, right, when he switches sides, that's how he becomes candidate for vice president with Andrew Jackson. He doesn't become vice president because he's got necessarily the qualifications, because he's the right man for the job. No, he is a major defector. It is a major gain, if you will, for the Democrats. I mean, they pretty much have stole this guy. And so they're like, okay, you've defected, and so we're going to reward you. So I do think it's important that we look at John C. Calhoun as the individual in making some of these decisions, because a lot of what he does is personal. It's based on what makes him look good, not necessarily, quote, for the sake of the country. And I say that because as we move into the nullification crisis, he starts spouting some things saying, I'm doing this for the man, I'm doing this for other people. But in reality, a lot of it he's doing for himself.
Yeah, he's doing for himself and his own agenda, you know, whatever that may be. The nullification issue starts in 1828 when Congress passes a tariff, the tariff of 1828. Now, for our listeners who may not be sure what a tariff is, basically it's a tax on goods being brought into a country, in this case, into the United States. The tariff of 1828, of course, raised tariffs on certain goods coming into the United States. Southerners, particularly in South Carolina, especially Southern farmers, don't like this because they see this as this is going to hurt their livelihood. You know, these people depend on this trade. These people depend on bringing in and sending out, and this could impact their bottom line poorly. So they are not very happy about this, and so John Calhoun is going to so I guess you say jump on the bandwagon with these people, these farmers there in South Carolina, and he is going to support their effort to protest this new tariff. In fact, in December of 1828, there is a piece of legislation passed there in South Carolina by the legislature, which declared the 1828 tariff, which they referred to as the Tariff of Abominations, declared it unconstitutional. And Chris, who was the author of that piece of legislation that went through the House of Representatives there in South Carolina? The author was none other than John C. Calhoun himself.
And what I think is also interesting is that all of this basically comes about when South Carolina gets news of this protective tariff that has been, instituted. There is an essay that is written, and it's written by John C. Calhoun, but he does it secretly. He does it anonymously, and he calls that I think it's called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, and that's where he states anonymously, because he's playing both sides, right? He's on the bandwagon for the South, but he's also got friends in the North. He's also trying to keep, he's trying to keep both sides happy, if you will. And it's in that secret essay that he says that states have the constitutional right to nullify or to claim void any federal government actions that they thought was unconstitutional. So if South Carolina, according to Calhoun, if South Carolina thought that this tariff was unconstitutional, then they could just basically thumb their nose up at it and say, you know what? No, it's null. And because it's null, it means it's void. And this is not good. But Ray, the problem with this is that he was the vice president to Jackson, right? And Jackson supported the tariff.
Oh, yeah.
And Calhoun is against the tariff. And so all of a sudden, probably one of the more fascinating vice president relationships begins to happen right now, right? Because you've got two fireheads and two very, it's all about me kind of attitudes. And so in this nullification crisis of 1832, you're going to see these relations between Jackson and Calhoun not just crumbling, but to the point where it is just about impossible for them to work together, much less even speak to one another.
Yeah, because South Carolina, they're not going to stop. They're going to pass an ordinance of nullification, which actually declares the tariff of 1828 and a later tariff, the tariff of 1832, null and void in the state of South Carolina. And President Andrew Jackson, being someone who is not going to sit back and just sort of let that kind of thing occur, he takes this seriously, and he views this. And Chris, I'm not someone who really sides with Andrew Jackson on a lot, but I can certainly understand where he was coming from in this particular situation. He views this as if South Carolina can get away with just sort of, as you said, thumbing its nose at federal law, just sort of randomly saying, well, we think this law is unconstitutional, so we're not going to abide by it. We think this tariff is unconstitutional, so we're not going to collect the tariff. If these states can get away with that, then what happens to the federal government? It becomes very weak. So Andrew Jackson is determined, of course, to defend the federal government's position against South Carolina, and, as you've already mentioned, against his vice president, John C. Calhoun, who is in South Carolina and who is, working the pro nullification side. And Chris, it gets so bad. You talked about the deterioration between the relationship between Andrew Jackson and John Calhoun. It gets so bad that Jackson apparently threatens off the record to hang Calhoun.
And not just hang Calhoun, he threatens to personally hang him.
Yeah.
He threatens to come down to South Carolina and find his vice president and personally hang him. But I think there's something to be said here. You have the vice president of the federal government of the United States who is organizing and sharing with a state, ignore what the federal government is doing. And what that does is creates a sense of instability, right? Because as you mentioned, if South Carolina can do it, Virginia can do it, Maryland can do it, New Jersey can do it, Georgia can do it. You don't have a government. You have 13 individual colonies that have regressed back to what it used to be instead of having the United States of America. And so this is a huge moment, to the point once Jackson threatens that he's coming down to hang Calhoun. Calhoun says, you don't like me. I don't like you. I heard you already have somebody in the wings that's going to take my place. I'm out of here. Mm-hmm. And he quits the administration. So he walks away from the vice presidency. And that is probably is a monumental marker for Calhoun, because the people in South Carolina then rally beyond their hero now, because he is a champion for South Carolina and other states in the South, Georgia, North Carolina. They're starting to say he's a champion for us as well. And so what happens is the South Carolina people, they choose him to become a United States senator now, who, replaces somebody who had just recently, I think, retired or something like that. So what happens is a vice president who basically has no voice now becomes a senator who has a bully pulpit, who has a voice as he speaks for the state of South Carolina. And that is just going to lead this to a whole new level that is really going to divide the country even further, because now publicly in the well of the Senate, he is going to come out and say that this is an overextension of federal power and that we are going to stay away from it. And that's going to lead Congress to have to step in and do something else.
And the one who steps in, the one who sort of takes the lead, is Henry Clay of Kentucky. He steps in and he puts forward a new tariff bill, sort of a compromise bill, that both South Carolina and the Jackson administration can sign on to. And we don't really need to get into the details of that bill here, I don't think. But Henry Clay, I think he's called the Great Compromiser or something like that.
He is.
And that's today when we hear the word compromise, we tend to think of it in a negative sense. But when we call Henry Clay the Great Compromiser, that's not meant in a negative way. He steps in numerous moments like this and comes up with a compromise that both sides can sign on to. And I think here he deserves credit for possibly averting a civil war, because I don't know if you mentioned this or not, but Andrew Jackson had gone to Congress and had requested a force bill, and he got this force bill in which he had permission to use the United States military against the state of South Carolina to force South Carolina to abide by this tariff. So Henry Clay coming in and sort of, saving the day, as it were, in a way, is a very good thing, because I don't think South Carolina, but especially not Andrew Jackson, were going to move on this issue.
They weren't going to sit quietly on this issue. And I do think it is important that Henry Clay does come in as the Great Compromiser, and South Carolina will repeal its nullification of the tariff. but they they nullify the force bill. So
Yeah.
I think that's funny, so they go in and say, oh, okay, yeah, null and void, we'll get away from that. So okay, we're going to allow the tariff. Oh, but by the way, we're still holding the card of the null and void, and you can't come down here and tell us what to do. So it is a compromise, but it's one of those compromises where you still want to win something. You want to say that I gave a little, but I gained more. And I think that you start to see that. And it is at that moment that Calhoun will become this leading political, but also intellectual defender of the South. And, at stake for him in this moment of time is the survival of the South, which I think is just a stark change of how fast he has changed gears from being an ardent supporter of the federal government to now basically saying, and this quote still comes back to me of what Calhoun said. He said, I have ever had but one opinion on the subject. Our fate as a people is bound up in the question. That he truly believed that the actions being taken by the federal government were going to destroy the South. It was going to remove the South from existence. And he was like, absolutely not. My aim is going to be to limit the power of the federal government. And he thought that he had done that, with the actions that he and South Carolina and the South had taken.
Yeah. And Andrew Jackson's not going to forget. Andrew Jackson's not a man to forget or forgive. In 1837, after Jackson has left office, or right before he leaves office, and I guess we can sort of wrap it up here, Chris. Someone goes to Andrew Jackson and asks, did he have any regrets? And Chris, you know what his comment was? No, I have no regrets. No, that was not his comment. His comment was, and I'm quoting the quote, I regret I was unable to shoot Henry Clay or hang John Calhoun, end quote. That tells you a little bit about where Andrew Jackson was in all of this. And the compromise may have been reached. Civil war may have been avoided for now. But Andrew Jackson hadn't forgotten.
You're absolutely right. And I do think we have to kind of go back and let history and the whole aspect of history. You and I, we hadn't talked about this, but in developing the concept of nullification, I don't think that Calhoun was intending to encourage the Southern states to succeed. I don't think that was his issue. I don't think he wanted a civil war, much less did he want there to be a division between the North and the South. My interpretation, and correct me if I'm wrong, is he just wanted to make sure that the Constitution was interpreted correctly, that there would be a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and that you would not have one person, one area, one group of states that was controlling the ultimate United States. That he was trying for there to be a balance. Yes, have your industry up in the North, but allow us in the South to have our agrarian culture. So I don't think he was trying to push it to the brink of war, but I think he was trying to push it back to we all have to agree to work together to make things happen. Do you think, is that about right? Do you think, or do you think he was
I think so generally. I mean, I think his view of the Constitution, his view of the states comes in part from Jefferson. And thus this allowance that states do have the constitutional right to nullify a law. But yeah, I think you're right. I think he viewed himself as defending South Carolina. And by virtue of defending South Carolina, defending the South from industrial North that didn't give a hoot, in his mind anyway, about how these things like this tariff of 1828 and the tariff of 1832 affected the economy of the South.
Yeah, and the final thing I'd say about Calhoun, though, is it is so important. History you should know, but you don't necessarily know it, is that here you have John C. Calhoun, who is fighting so hard to protect the minority rights of the South against the very big and powerful North. But yet he's also a slaveholder that is discriminating against the interest of the minority in the South and allowing the majority of the South's whites to have control. There is some hypocrisy there. And I think that's why you have to look at the whole narrative of what's going on. You know, that while Calhoun is trying to argue for this semblance of togetherness, he's also at the same time breaking a relationship in the South that will ultimately destroy the South. And that is in the form of slavery.
Yeah, and you see that controversy today with buildings that were named after Calhoun, et cetera. Those buildings be renamed and stuff because of his support of slavery, which, you know, regardless of what you think about nullification, his support of slavery, like the support that many people in the South at this particular point in time had for slavery, is very unfortunate and is a sort of a mark against him in a major way there. So anyway, Chris, thanks for another great episode. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode. Please share this episode with your family and friends. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, iHeart, Podcast Now, Spotify, Sounder FM, Google Podcast. We're all over the place, Chris. If you have any questions or comments, please look us up on Facebook, Twitter. You can send us an email at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know at gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.